Part 2 of the portrait. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Red Abras. The Open Door and the Portrait. Stories of the Seen and Unseen by Margaret O. Oliphant. The Portrait, Part 2. The drawing room was already lighted with a flickering array of candles upon the mantelpiece and along the walls, producing the pretty, starry effect which candles give without very much light. As I had not the smallest idea what I was about to see, for Morphew's speaking likeness was very hurriedly said, and only half comprehensible in the bewilderment of my faculties, my first glance was at this very unusual illumination, for which I could assign no reason. The next showed me a large full length portrait, still in the box in which apparently it had travelled, placed upright, supported against a table in the centre of the room. My father walked straight up to it, motioned to me to place a smaller table close to the picture on the left side, and put his lamp upon that. Then he waved his hand towards it, and stood aside that I might see. It was a full length portrait of a very young woman, I might say a girl scarcely 20, in a white dress, made in a very simple old fashion, though I was too little accustomed to female costume to be able to fix the date. It might have been 100 years old, or 20 for aught I knew. The face had an expression of youth, candor, and simplicity more than any face I had ever seen, or so at least in my surprise I thought. The eyes were a little wistful, with something which was almost anxiety, which at least was not content in them. A faint, almost imperceptible curve in the lids. The complexion was of a dazzling fairness, the hair light but the eyes dark, which gave individuality to the face. It would have been as lovely had the eyes been blue, probably more so, but their darkness gave a touch of character, a slight discord which made the harmony finer. It was not, perhaps, beautiful in the highest sense of the word. The girl must have been too young, too slight, too little developed for actual beauty. But a face which so invited love and confidence I never saw. One smiled at it with instinctive affection. "What a sweet face!" I said. "What a lovely girl! Who is she? Is this one of the relations you were speaking of on the other side?" My father made me no reply. He stood aside, looking at it as if he knew it too well to require to look, as if the picture was already in his eyes. "Yes," he said, after an interval, with a long drawn breath. "She was a lovely girl, as you say." "Was? Then she is dead? What a pity!" I said. "What a pity, so young and so sweet!" We stood gazing at her thus, in her beautiful stillness and calm. Two men, the younger of us full grown and conscious of many experiences, the other an old man, before this impression of tender youth. At length he said, with a slight tremulousness in his voice, "Does nothing suggest to you who she is, Phil?" I turned round to look at him with profound astonishment, but he turned away from my look. A sort of quiver passed over his face. "That is your mother," he said, and walked suddenly away, leaving me there. My mother! I stood for a moment in a kind of consternation before the white-robed innocent creature, to me no more than a child. Then a sudden laugh broke from me. Without any will of mine, something ludicrous as well as something awful was in it. When the laugh was over, I found myself with tears in my eyes, gazing, holding my breath. The soft features seemed to melt, the lips to move, the anxiety in the eyes to become a personal inquiry. "Ah, no, Nothing of the kind, only because of the water in mine. My mother? Oh, fair and gentle creature! Scarcely woman, how could any man's voice call her by that name? I had little idea enough of what it meant, had heard it, laughed at, scoffed at, reverenced, but never had learned to place it even among the ideal powers of life. Yet if it meant anything at all, what it meant was worth thinking of. What did she ask looking at me with those eyes? What would she have said if those lips had language? If I had known her only as Cowper did, with a child's recollection? There might have been some thread, some faint but comprehensible link between us. But now all that I felt was the curious incongruity. Poor child, I said to myself. So sweet a creature. Poor little tender soul, as if she had been a little sister, a child of mine. But my mother? I cannot tell how long I stood looking at her, studying the sweet candid face, which surely had germs in it of everything that was good and beautiful, and sorry, with a profound regret, that she had died and never carried those promises to fulfillment. Poor girl! Poor people who had loved her! These were my thoughts, with a curious vertigo and giddiness of my whole being in the sense of a mysterious relationship, which it was beyond my power to understand. Presently my father came back, possibly because I had been a long time unconscious of the passage of the minutes, or perhaps because he was himself restless in the strange disturbance of his habitual calm. He came in and put his arm within mine, leaning his weight partially upon me, with an affectionate suggestion which went deeper than words. I pressed his arm to my side. It was more between us two grave Englishmen than any embracing. "I cannot understand it," I said. "No, I don't wonder at that. But if it is strange to you, Phil, think how much more strange to me. That is the partner of my life. I have never had another, or thought of another. That girl. If we were to meet again, as I have always hoped we should meet again, what am I to say to her? I, an old man. Yes, I know what you mean. I am not an old man for my years, but my years are 70, and the play is nearly played out. How am I to meet that young creature? We used to say to each other that it was forever, that we never could be but one, that it was for life and death. But what am I to say to her, Phil, when I meet her again? That angel. No, it is not her being an angel that troubles me, but she is so young. She is like my granddaughter," he cried with a burst of what was half sobs, half laughter. "And she is my wife, and I am an old man, and so much has happened that she could not understand." I was too much startled by this strange complaint to know what to say. It was not my own trouble, and I answered it in the conventional way. "They are not as we are, sir," I said. "They look upon us with larger other eyes than ours." "Ah, you don't know what I mean," he said quickly, and in the interval he had subdued his emotion. "At first, after she died, it was my consolation to think that I should meet her again, that we never could be really parted. But my God, how I have changed since then! I am another man. I am a different being. I was not very young even then, 20 years older than she was, but her youth renewed mine. I was not an unfit partner. She asked no better, and knew as much more than I did, in some things, being so much nearer the source, as I did in others that were of the world. But I have gone a long way since then, Phil, a long way, and there she stands, just where I left her." I pressed his arm again. "Father," I said, which was a title I seldom used, "we are not to suppose that in a higher life the mind stands still." I did not feel myself qualified to discuss such topics, but something one must say. Worse, worse, he replied. Then she too will be like me, a different being, and we shall meet as what? As strangers, as people who have lost sight of each other, with a long past between us? We who parted, my God, with. His voice broke and ended for a moment. Then, while surprised and almost shocked by what he said, I cast about in my mind what to reply. He withdrew his arm suddenly from mine and said in his usual tone, "Where shall we hang the picture, Phil? It must be here in this room. What do you think will be the best light?" This sudden alteration took me still more by surprise, and gave me almost an additional shock. But it was evident that I must follow the changes of his mood, or at least the sudden repression of sentiment which he originated. We went into that simpler question with great seriousness, consulting which would be the best light. "You know, I can scarcely advise," I said. "I have never been familiar with this room. I should like to put off, if you don't mind, till daylight." "I think," he said, "that this would be the best place." It was on the other side of the fireplace, on the wall which faced the windows. Not the best light, I knew enough to be aware, for an oil painting. When I said so, however, he answered me with a little impatience. "It does not matter very much about the best light. There will be nobody to see it but you and me." "I have reasons." There was a small table standing against the wall at this spot, on which he had his hand as he spoke. Upon it stood a little basket in a very fine lace-like wicker work. His hand must have trembled, for the table shook, and the basket fell, its contents turning out upon the carpet little bits of needlework, colored silks, a small piece of knitting half done. He laughed as they rolled out at his feet, and tried to stoop to collect them, then tottered to a chair, and covered for a moment his face with his hands. No need to ask what they were. No woman's work had been seen in the house since I could recollect it. I gathered them up reverently and put them back. I could see, ignorant as I was, that the bit of knitting was something for an infant. What could I do less than put it to my lips? It had been left in the doing for me. "Yes, I think this is the best place," my father said a minute after, in his usual tone. We placed it there that evening with our own hands. The picture was large and in a heavy frame, but my father would let no one help me but himself. And then, with a superstition for which I never could give any reason even to myself, having removed the packings, we closed and locked the door, leaving the candles about the room in their soft, strange illumination, lighting the first night of her return to her old place. That night no more was said. My father went to his room early, which was not his habit. He had never, however, accustomed me to sit late with him in the library. I had a little study or smoking room of my own, in which all my special treasures were, the collections of my travels and my favorite books, and where I always sat after prayers, a ceremonial which was regularly kept up in the house. I retired as usual this night to my room, and as usual read, but to night somewhat vaguely, often pausing to think. When it was quite late, I went out by the glass door to the lawn, and walked around the house, with the intention of looking in at the drawing room window, as I had done when a child. But I had forgotten that these windows were all shuttered at night, and nothing but a faint penetration of the light within through the crevices bore witness to the installment of the new dweller there. In the morning my father was entirely himself again. He told me without emotion of the manner in which he had obtained the picture. It had belonged to my mother's family, and had fallen eventually into the hands of a cousin of hers, resident abroad, a man whom I did not like, and who did not like me, my father said. There was, or had been, some rivalry, he thought. A mistake, but he was never aware of that. He refused all my requests to have a copy made. You may suppose, Phil, that I wished this very much. Had I succeeded, you would have been acquainted at least with your mother's appearance, and need not have sustained this shock. But he would not consent. It gave him, I think, a certain pleasure to think that he had the only picture. But now he is dead, and out of remorse or with some other intention has left it to me. That looks like kindness, said I. Yes, or something else. He might have thought that by so doing he was establishing a claim upon me, my father said. But he did not seem disposed to add any more. On whose behalf he meant to establish a claim I did not know, nor who the man was who had laid us under so great an obligation on his deathbed. He had established a claim on me, at least, though as he was dead I could not see on whose behalf it was, and my father said nothing more. He seemed to dislike the subject. When I attempted to return to it, he had recourse to his letters or his newspapers. Evidently he had made up his mind to say no more. Afterwards I went into the drawing room to look at the picture once more. It seemed to me that the anxiety in her eyes was not so evident as I had thought it last night. The light possibly was more favorable. She stood just above the place where I make no doubt she had sat in life, where her little work basket was, not very much above it. The picture was full length, and we had hung it low, so that she might have been stepping into the room, and was little above my own level as I stood and looked at her again. Once more I smiled at the strange thought that this young creature, so young, almost childish, could be my mother, and once more my eyes grew wet, looking at her. He was a benefactor indeed, who had given her back to us. I said to myself that if I could ever do anything for him or his, I would certainly do it, for this lovely young creature's sake. And with this in my mind, and all the thoughts that came with it, I am obliged to confess that the other matter which I had been so full of on the previous night went entirely out of my head. It is rarely, however, that such matters are allowed to slip out of one's mind. When I went out in the afternoon for my usual stroll, or rather when I returned from that stroll, I saw once more before me the woman with her baby, whose story had filled me with dismay on the previous evening. She was waiting at the gate as before, and, "Oh, gentlemen, but haven't you got some news to give me?" she said. "My good woman, I have been greatly occupied. I have had no time to do anything." "Ah," she said, with a little cry of disappointment, "my man said not to make too sure, and that the ways of the gentlefolks is hard to know." "I cannot explain to you," I said as gently as I could, "what it is that has made me forget you. It was an event that can only do you good in the end. Go home now, and see the man that took your things from you, and tell him to come to me. I promise you it shall all be put right." The woman looked at me in astonishment, then burst forth, as it seemed, involuntarily, "What? Without asking no questions?" After this there came a storm of tears and blessings, from which I made haste to escape, but not without carrying the curious commentary on my rashness away with me. Without asking no questions? It might be foolish, perhaps, but after all, how slight a matter! To make the poor creature comfortable at the cost of what? A box or two of cigars, perhaps, or some other trifle? And if it should be her own fault, or her husband's, what then? Had I been punished for all my faults, where should I have been now? And if the advantage should be only temporary, what then? To be relieved and comforted even for a day or two, was not that something to count in life? Thus I quenched the fiery dart of criticism which my protégée herself had thrown into the transaction, not without a certain sense of the humor of it. Its effect, however, was to make me less anxious to see my father, to repeat my proposal to him, and to call his attention to the cruelty performed in his name. This one case I had taken out of the category of wrongs to be righted, by assuming arbitrarily the position of providence in my own person, for of course I had bound myself to pay the poor creature's rent as well as redeem her goods, and whatever might happen to her in the future had taken the past into my own hands. The man came presently to see me, who, it seems, had acted as my father's agent in the matter. "I don't know, sir, how Mr. Canning will take it," he said. "He don't want none of those irregular bad paying ones in his property. He always says as to look over it and let the rent run on is making things worse in the end. His rule is never more than a month, Stevens. That's what Mr. Canning says to me, sir. He says, more than that they can't pay. It's no use trying. And it's a good rule. It's a very good rule. He won't hear none of their stories, sir. Bless you, you would never get a penny of rent from them small houses if you listen to their tales. But if so be as you will pay Mrs. Jordan's rent, it's none of my business how it's paid so long as it's paid, and I'll send her back her things. But they will just have to be took next time," he added composedly. "Over and over, it's always the same story with them sort of poor folks. They are too poor for anything, that's the truth," the man said. Morphew came back to my room after my visitor was gone. "Mr. Philip," he said, "you will excuse me, sir, but if you are going to pay all the poor folks' rent as have distresses put in, you may just go into the court at once, for it's without end." "I'm going to be the agent myself, Morphew, and manage for my father, and we'll soon put a stop to that," I said more cheerfully than I felt. "Manage for master?" he said with a face of consternation. "You, Mr. Philip? You seem to have a great contempt for me, Morphew." He did not deny the fact. He said with excitement, "Master, sir, master don't let himself be put a stop to by any man. Master's not one to be managed. Don't you quarrel with master, Mr. Philip, for the love of God." The old man was quite pale. "Quarrel?" I said. "I have never quarrelled with my father, and I don't mean to begin now." Morphew dispelled his own excitement by making up the fire, which was dying in the grate. It was a very mild spring evening, and he made up a great blaze which would have suited December. This is one of many ways in which an old servant will relieve his mind. He muttered all the time as he threw on the coals and wood. "He will not like it. We all know as he will not like it. Master won't stand no meddling, Mr. Philip." This last he discharged at me like a flying arrow as he closed the door. I soon found there was truth in what he said. My father was not angry. He was even half amused. "I don't think that plan of yours will hold water, Phil. I hear you have been paying rents and redeeming furniture. That's an expensive game, and a very profitless one. Of course, so long as you are a benevolent gentleman acting for your own pleasure, it makes no difference to me. I am quite content if I get my money, even out of your pockets, so long as it amuses you. But as my collector, you know, which you are good enough to propose to be." "Of course I should act under your orders," I said, "but at least you might be sure that I would not commit you to any." I paused for a word. "Act of oppression," he said with a smile. "Piece of cruelty, exaction, there are half a dozen words." "Sir," I cried, "stop, Phil, and let us understand each other. I hope I have always been a just man. I do my duty on my side, and I expect it from others. It is your benevolence that is cruel. I have calculated anxiously how much credit it is safe to allow, but I will allow no man or woman either to go beyond what he or she can make up. My law is fixed. Now you understand? My agents, as you call them, originate nothing. They execute only what I decide." "But then no circumstances are taken into account, no bad luck, no evil chances, no loss unexpected?" "There are no evil chances," he said. "There is no bad luck. They reap as they sow. No, I don't go among them to be cheated by their stories, and spend quite unnecessary emotion in sympathizing with them. You will find it much better for you that I don't. I deal with them on a general rule made, I assure you, not without a great deal of thought." "And must it always be so?" I said. "Is there no way of ameliorating or bringing in a better state of things?" It seems not, he said. We don't get no forrarder in that direction so far as I can see. And then he turned the conversation to general matters. I retired to my room greatly discouraged that night. In former ages, or so one is led to suppose, and in the lower primitive classes who still linger near the primeval type, action of any kind was and is easier than amid the complications of our higher civilization. A bad man is a distinct entity, against whom you know more or less what steps to take. A tyrant, an oppressor, a bad landlord, a man who lets miserable tenements at a rack rent, to come down to particulars, and exposes his wretched tenants to all those abominations of which we have heard so much. Well, he is more or less a satisfactory opponent. There he is, and there is nothing to be said for him. Down with him, and let there be an end of his wickedness. But when, on the contrary, you have before you a good man, a just man, who has considered deeply a question which you allow to be full of difficulty, who regrets, but cannot, being human, avert the miseries which to some unhappy individuals follow from the very wisdom of his rule, what can you do? What is to be done? Individual benevolence at haphazard may balk him here and there, but what have you to put in the place of his well considered scheme? Charity which makes paupers, or what else? I had not considered the question deeply, but it seemed to me that I now came to a blank wall, which my vague human sentiment of pity and scorn could find no way to breach. There must be wrong somewhere, but where? There must be some change for the better to be made, but how? I was seated with a book before me on the table, with my head supported on my hands. My eyes were on the printed page, but I was not reading. My mind was full of these thoughts, my heart of great discouragement and despondency, a sense that I could do nothing, yet that there surely must and ought, if I but knew it, be something to do. The fire which Morphew had built up before dinner was dying out. The shaded lamp on my table left all the corners in a mysterious twilight. The house was perfectly still, no one moving. My father in the library, where, after the habit of many solitary years, he liked to be left alone, and I here in my retreat, preparing for the formation of similar habits. I thought all at once of the third member of the party, the newcomer, alone too in the room that had been hers, and there suddenly occurred to me a strong desire to take up my lamp and go to the drawing room and visit her, to see whether her soft, angelic face would give any inspiration. I restrained, however, this futile impulse, for what could the picture say? And instead wondered what might have been had she lived, had she been there, warmly enthroned beside the warm domestic centre, the hearth which would have been a common sanctuary, the true home. In that case, what might have been? Alas, the question was no more simple to answer than the other. She might have been there alone too, her husband's business, her son's thoughts, as far from her as now, when her silent representative held her old place in the silence and darkness. I had known it so often enough. Love itself does not always give comprehension and sympathy. It might be that she was more to us there, in the sweet image of her undeveloped beauty, than she might have been had she lived and grown to maturity and fading like the rest. I cannot be certain whether my mind was still lingering on this not very cheerful reflection, or if it had been left behind when the strange occurrence came of which I have now to tell. Can I call it an occurrence? My eyes were on my book when I thought I heard the sound of a door opening and shutting, but so far away and faint that if real at all, it must have been in a far corner of the house. I did not move except to lift my eyes from the book, as one does instinctively, the better to listen. When? But I cannot tell, nor have I ever been able to describe exactly what it was. My heart made all at once a sudden leap in my breast. I am aware that this language is figurative and that the heart cannot leap, but it is a figure so entirely justified by sensation that no one will have any difficulty in understanding what I mean. My heart leaped up and began beating wildly in my throat, in my ears, as if my whole being had received a sudden and intolerable shock. The sound went through my head like the dizzy sound of some strange mechanism, a thousand wheels and springs circling, echoing, working in my brain. I felt the blood bound in my veins. My mouth became dry, my eyes hot. A sense of something insupportable took possession of me. I sprang to my feet, and then I sat down again. I cast a quick glance round me beyond the brief circle of the lamplight, but there was nothing there to account in any way for this sudden, extraordinary rush of sensation, nor could I feel any meaning in it, any suggestion, any moral impression. I thought I must be going to be ill, and got out my watch and felt my pulse. It was beating furiously, about 125 throbs in a minute. I knew of no illness that could come on like this without warning in a moment, and I tried to subdue myself, to say to myself that it was nothing, some flutter of the nerves, some physical disturbance. I laid myself down upon my sofa to try if rest would help me, and kept still, as long as the thumping and throbbing of this wild, excited mechanism within, like a wild beast plunging and struggling, would let me. I am quite aware of the confusion of the metaphor. The reality was just so. It was like a mechanism deranged, going wildly with ever increasing precipitation, like those horrible wheels that from time to time catch a helpless human being in them and tear him to pieces. But at the same time, it was like a maddened living creature making the wildest efforts to get free. When I could bear this no longer, I got up and walked about my room. Then, having still a certain command of myself, though I could not master the commotion within me, I deliberately took down an exciting book from the shelf, a book of breathless adventure which had always interested me, and tried with that to break the spell. After a few minutes, however, I flung the book aside. I was gradually losing all power over myself. What I should be moved to do, to shout aloud, to struggle with I know not what, or if I was going mad altogether, and next moment must be a raving lunatic, I could not tell. I kept looking round, expecting I don't know what. Several times with the corner of my eye I seemed to see a movement, as if someone was stealing out of sight. But when I looked straight, there was never anything but the plain outlines of the wall and carpet, the chairs standing in good order. At last I snatched up the lamp in my hand and went out of the room, to look at the picture which had been faintly showing in my imagination from time to time, the eyes, more anxious than ever, looking at me from out the silent air. But no, I passed the door of that room swiftly, moving, it seemed, without any volition of my own, and before I knew where I was going, went into my father's library with my lamp in my hand. He was still sitting there at his writing table. He looked up astonished to see me hurrying in with my light. "Phil," he said, surprised. I remember that I shut the door behind me and came up to him and set down the lamp on the table. My sudden appearance alarmed him. "What is the matter?" he cried. "Philip, what have you been doing with yourself?" I sat down on the nearest chair and gasped, gazing at him. The wild commotion ceased, the blood subsided into its natural channels, my heart resumed its place. I use such words as mortal weakness can to express the sensations I felt. I came to myself thus, gazing at him, confounded at once by the extraordinary passion which I had gone through, and its sudden cessation. "The matter?" I cried. "I don't know what is the matter." My father had pushed his spectacles up from his eyes. He appeared to me as faces appear in a fever, all glorified with light, which is not in them, his eyes glowing, his white hair shining like silver, but his looks were severe. "You are not a boy that I should reprove you, but you ought to know better," he said. Then I explained to him, so far as I was able, what had happened. Had happened. Nothing had happened. He did not understand me, nor did I, now that it was over, understand myself. But he saw enough to make him aware that the disturbance in me was serious, and not caused by any folly of my own. He was very kind as soon as he had assured himself of this, and talked, taking pains to bring me back to unexciting subjects. He had a letter in his hand with a very deep border of black when I came in. I observed it, without taking any notice or associating it with anything I knew. He had many correspondents, and although we were excellent friends, we had never been on those confidential terms which warrant one man in asking another from whom a special letter has come. We were not so near to each other as this, though we were father and son. After a while I went back to my own room and finished the evening in my usual way, without any return of the excitement which, now that it was over, looked to me like some extraordinary dream. What had it meant? Had it meant anything? I said to myself that it must be purely physical, something gone temporarily amiss, which had righted itself. It was physical. The excitement did not affect my mind. I was independent of it all the time, a spectator of my own agitation, a clear proof of that. Whatever it was, it had affected my bodily organization alone. Next day I returned to the problem which I had not been able to solve. I found out my petitioner in the back street, and that she was happy in the recovery of her possessions, which to my eyes indeed did not seem very worthy either of lamentation or delight. Nor was her house the tidy house which injured virtue should have when restored to its humble rights. She was not injured virtue, it was clear. She made me a great many curtsies, and poured forth a number of blessings. Her man came in while I was there, and hoped in a gruff voice that God would reward me, and that the old gentleman would let them alone. I did not like the look of the man. It seemed to me that in the dark lane behind the house of a winter's night he would not be a pleasant person to find in one's way. Nor was this all. When I went out into the little street, which it appeared was all or almost all my father's property, a number of groups formed in my way, and at least half a dozen applicants sidled up. "I have more claims nor Mary Jordan any day," said one. "I have lived on Squire Canning's property one place and another this 20 year, and what do you say to me?" said another. "I have 6 children to her, too, bless you, sir, and never a father to do for them. I believed in my father's rule before I got out of the street, and approved his wisdom in keeping himself free from personal contact with his tenants. Yet when I looked back upon the swarming thoroughfare, the mean little houses, the women at their doors, all so open-mouthed and eager to contend for my favor, my heart sank within me at the thought that out of their misery some portion of our wealth came. I don't care how small a portion, that I, young and strong, should be kept idle and in luxury in some part through the money screwed out of their necessities, obtained sometimes by the sacrifice of everything they prized. Of course, I know all the ordinary commonplaces of life as well as any one, that if you build a house with your hand or your money and let it, the rent of it is your just due, and must be paid. But yet, don't you think, sir, I said that evening at dinner, the subject being reintroduced by my father himself, that we have some duty towards them when we draw so much from them? "Certainly," he said. "I take as much trouble about their drains as I do about my own." "That is always something, I suppose." "Something? It is a great deal. It is more than they get anywhere else. I keep them clean as far as that's possible. I give them at least the means of keeping clean, and thus check disease, and prolong life, which is more, I assure you, than they have any right to expect." I was not prepared with arguments as I ought to have been. That is all in the gospel according to Adam Smith, which my father had been brought up in, but of which the tenets had begun to be less binding in my day. I wanted something more, or else something less. But my views were not so clear, nor my system so logical and well built, as that upon which my father rested his conscience, and drew his percentage with a light heart. Yet I thought there were signs in him of some perturbation. I met him one morning coming out of the room in which the portrait hung, as if he had gone to look at it stealthily. He was shaking his head and saying "No, no" to himself, not perceiving me, and I stepped aside when I saw him so absorbed. For myself, I entered that room but little. I went outside, as I had so often done when I was a child, and looked through the windows into the still and now sacred place, which had always impressed me with a certain awe. Looked at so, the slight figure in its white dress seemed to be stepping down into the room from some slight visionary altitude, looking with that which had seemed to me at first anxiety, which I sometimes represented to myself now as a wistful curiosity, as if she were looking for the life which might have been hers. Where was the existence that had belonged to her, the sweet household place, the infant she had left? She would no more recognize the man who thus came to look at her as through a veil, with a mystic reverence, than I could recognize her. I could never be her child to her, any more than she could be a mother to me. End of part two of the portrait. Recording by Red Abras, December 2007.